Hello! In this episode, we will be talking about fasting. Fasting is mentioned everywhere nowadays. We are going to talk with Dr. Valter Longo about the ins and outs of fasting. We will understand the physiological basis behind it. Why is this useful? What are the dangers of using this? What is the role of personalized nutrition and how fasting can be part of those plans? And we are going to have an interesting discussion about fast mimicking diets, those diets that cause similar changes to what fasting does, and how the changes in physiology can be used for the benefit of patients. We will also discuss the importance of the healthcare provider in the process of transmitting this knowledge to their patients and how to implement these changes in that population. The discussion with Dr. Longo is very deep, and his expertise is unique, and you will really enjoy his viewpoints. And I think that incorporating fasting and fast mimicking diets is something to consider. And I think the positive and negative aspects have to be taken into consideration. And at the end of this episode, we will have a better idea about this kind of new way of thinking, even though fasting has been prevalent in different cultures, but now more people are interested in this topic. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Dr. Longo.
Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. Join us as we delve into the behind-the-scenes world of groundbreaking research and the dynamic healthcare industry, interviewing top paper authors, engaging experts on industry-related topics, and exploring medical subjects that affect our daily lives.
Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. I'm your host, Efrain Riveros, Dr. E. Efrain. Today, we are going to be talking about the effect of different types of fasting and restrictions in dietary patterns, and the effect of those in relation to circadian rhythms. And this has a significant impact on wellness and health. We have a very special guest today, one of the leaders in the world in research regarding these topics. We have with us Dr. Valter Longo. Dr. Longo is a professor of gerontology and biological sciences, Edna M. Jones Chair in Gerontology at the University of Southern California. He also is the director of a molecular oncology lab in Milan, Italy. The name of the lab is IFOM. And we are going to be talking about different aspects regarding his experience and all his knowledge. And we will also discuss one of his papers that was published in 2016 in the Cell and Metabolism journal. The name of the title of the paper is Fasting, Circadian Rhythms, and Time-Restricted Feeding in Healthy Lifespan. So first of all, welcome, Dr. Longo, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for hosting me.
Thank you. So we normally start by asking an introductory question, and is what was the motivation for you to start exploring these nutrition aspects?
My motivation has always been about longevity and healthy longevity. I always say that physicians should probably start with a course on healthy longevity and finish with a course on healthy longevity, the medical school. That's not the case, but I think almost everybody agrees that probably should be the focus of medicine. But yeah, in my case, it's been interested in the medical aspects of it, but also in the scientific aspects of it. You know, why do all organisms live a certain period of time and then they everything goes wrong and then eventually die, right? So that's it's been my passion since I was probably 18 years old.
Yeah, and you are completely right that we are in in urgent need for the medical profession to be more aware of all these aspects and needs to be educated. And the diffusion of this type of research is definitely going to achieve that goal over time. My next question has to do with something that you start mentioning in the paper that is very interesting. And even you mentioned it before going into the nutritional aspects per se. And is the role of the circadian cycle in different physiological processes, and how there is an oscillation also related to the fed state and the fasting state. So let's start with that. What is the importance of the circadian cycle in terms of nutrition?
Well, the circadian cycle is very tightly linked to metabolic pathways, right? And metabolism for obvious reasons, right? So we feed, and we used to feed during the light period of the day. And so probably eventually these have co-evolved, right? So the light cycle and the nutrition cycle. And so, they don't know how to be apart. And if you start shifting, and so eating during the dark cycle or during the wrong time of the day, probably the system suffers by not being by exiting this program that has some foundation that are going back billions of years, not just millions of years, but billions of years in basic in simple organisms. And so I think that's why as people are increasing the amount of time where they eat, from what maybe used to be 11, 12 hours a day to now about 15 hours a day in the United States. So the people eat all the time. And so now they're entering an area that historically was meant for sleeping. And so now the system is confused. And from that, metabolic dysregulation and lots of problems. And that's exactly what we see in the United States, but also, we see it all over the world now. It's just a matter of time before this becomes a worldwide problem. But it's already a European problem. It's already an Asian problem. It's a Middle Eastern problem. It's a South American, Central America problem. So, I think it's just maybe you need a few more years to reach the entire world.
Yeah, and that's true. You know how with industrialization and the lifestyle that we have right now, we are working during times that we shouldn't be working. Probably we should be sleeping or something, and we are distributing the access to food throughout the day. So we could say that we are, as a society, we are always thinking of eating, to the problem that our relationship with the food became a little bit weird. And in that exact context, the same way that the environment has been changing, as you mentioned, in terms of circadian cycle, there are also some interventions, people trying to change the cycle of feeding and fasting. So, and I want to move on into the fasting part. So there are different types of diets, right? And you mentioned that in your paper, that there are some paradigms in terms of calorie restriction and changing the amount of food that you take during certain periods of time. So can you tell us a little bit about the different, say, diets and types of fasting that you study?
Yes. So me and others, there are a few major types of fasting, and one of them, it's called time-restricted eating, and it basically refers to how many hours per day you eat. And there's a lot of misconception about this TRE, and most people, or a lot of people, seem to think that fasting for 16 hours and eating for eight hours is a good thing. But it turns out that and maybe I'm one of the few that talks about this, and I'm not sure why, but it turns out that a lot of studies now, in some of them in leading journals, indicate that if you skip breakfast, you're gonna have a shorter life and you're gonna have lots more problems. And so most people that do 16 hours of fasting, they skip breakfast. So already we have a problem, right? That there is a miscommunication and people sort of. I think there's a world now in the hands of people that know very little about any of this, and they go out and preach to millions of people. This is what you should do, you know. And yeah, so that's unfortunate. And so now we're starting to. So 16 hours could be very beneficial for you, but now if it involves skipping breakfast, it's going to put you in a dangerous zone. And now we also know there's a few papers that came out last year that may begin to explain why. And these papers show that if you hospitalize people and you feed them, and if you take the same people, a group of people, and you give them the same exact amount of food, the same food, but you start at 8 a.m. versus the same food that started at 12 p.m., now in the long run, the people that start at 12, they're going to have less energy expenditure. So their metabolism basically slows and they're more hungry, right? Right. So then, you know, imagine now this going on for years and years and years. You're hungrier and with a slower metabolism. And that's how, so now you're doing 16 hours of fasting, but you're eating normally, and now your metabolism slows and you're hungry all the time. So yeah, this is what they're suggested. Now, of course, the 16 hours, if you're very disciplined, you know, they could also give you a lot of benefits, and so problems and benefits, they probably, you know, cancel out. But it seemed to be that maybe the problems are going to be bigger than the benefits because these people live shorter. And yeah, so that's but so I think in the discussion with Sachin Panda, our compromise or my compromise with him is like 12 to 13 hours of fasting, right? So are we in agreement that 12, maybe 13 hours of fasting is very healthy for everybody? It should not involve skipping breakfast. Yeah, so I think that's where I like to think that Sachin and I agree that let's stick with that. Unless you have cancer, and then there's some data saying maybe 13, 14 hours or longer, because you have a much bigger problem. And then now there's some large studies that are associating longer nightly fasting period with the overall survival, a better overall survival. And so I have to say for that, we've been saying maybe talk to your oncologist, but well, I mean, you could talk to your oncologist, but the oncologist is not going to know much about fasting. But in general, unless the oncologist is opposed to it, it might be good to say, let's say, fast for 14 hours a day, a night, and that's it. Then there is other type of fasting. Our favorite is periodic fasting, mimicking diets. Now, this is less related to the circadian clock and more related to, you know, the history of human being and the history of any organism that you can think of. So any organism that you can think of, most microbes are fasting most of the times, right? And then they eat and then they go back to fasting most of the time. So, but even human beings, our history was very frequent periods of fasting. And now for the last, 50 years, there is no fasting anymore. You know, we eat all the time. And so the fasting mimicking diet has been most of our work related to, well, what happens if you take a person, even a healthy person, normal weight, and periodically expose them to a 5-day vegan, like what we call fasting mimicking diet that triggers the same responses in the body that would be triggered by water only fasting, as if you did not eat at all. And yeah, so then we carried out many clinical trials and then many mouse studies, and so this is different from the time restricted eating because it pushes you for 5 days, 4 to 7 days, but say most people 5 days into this full fasting response. And we think that this full fasting response has lots of jobs, and some of them are remarkable jobs. For example, in mice and rats, we see now Yamanaka factors be turned on. And the cells of the pancreas, the cells of the kidney, the cells of a lot of different organs are now turning into embryonic-like cells. You're starting to see, they transform. So you have, first of all, you have autophagy, self-feeding process, and then you started to see these, Yamanaka factors that are associated with embryonic development. They turned on, and they sort of reset the age of the cell. And now in people, we don't know yet, but certainly, this is very clear in animal studies, and so most likely it's also happening in people. And so, this is probably not going to happen during the shorter time restricted daily process, but it happens after this 5-day, let's say once a month to once every 3 or 4 months fasting mimicking diet process.
So emphasizing a little bit on the fasting mimicking diets for our audience, what does it consist of? So how many calories during those 5 days?
Yeah, so the FMD, I mean, there's lots of different FMDs, like the one for cancer patient, the one for Alzheimer patient, and all have different calories and different day lengths, right? So the one for autoimmunity is often are 7 days long. But the one for relatively normal people, let's say overweight, obese, people that may have minor issues like high cholesterol, blood pressure, that's 1,100 calories on day 1, and then going to 800 calories or so on day 2, 3, 4, 5.
And in terms of macronutrients, how are they distributed?
In terms of macronutrients, it's a high fat, low sugar, low protein diet.
Okay. So your studies have been focusing on this, and it's actually very exciting what you guys have been able to show. But before we go into that, I want you to tell us a little bit, you mentioned that already, that unicellular organisms have these cycles of fasting, like well established. And can you tell us from the molecular standpoint what happens, say, in a yeast during those periods of fasting?
Yeah, so, and I think, people look at hear yeast and they think, why would we care what yeast do, right? But I think that it's very fundamental because if you look at a yeast organism, it can live in 3 ways, right? It can live in the sort of like very high metabolic fast lane, and it goes for about 3 or 4 days. And then they can live in something called stationary phase, which is like starving, literally completely starving, water only. And now these 3 or 4 days go to, like, say, 2 weeks or so, right? And now I just live a lot longer just by starving them. And then there's something else called the spore state. And in the spore state, where the metabolism slows dramatically and there's a lot of changes, but now it can live 100 times. It can live for 300 days or so, right? Or 400 days. So now imagine that, right? And the same organism can go from 3 days to 3 or 4 days to 300 or 400 days based on what program it enters, right? And this is why it's so important to understand this, because forget the 100-fold lifespan extension, but could we have an ambition to make people live 30% longer, right? So it's very far from, 100 times, right? 30%, like, yeah, okay, so 30% healthier, let's say, 30% longer health span. That's very difficult, but it's very doable. And so that's what we focus on. So people on average, let's say, make it to 80 years of age. So could we do 104, 105 average lifespan? And I think it's not going to happen for the world population because people don't listen. They do whatever they want to do. But I think it may very well happen for that 500 million to 1 billion people, who knows what it's going to be. They're going to say, look, I'm going to listen to all of it, right? I'm going to follow the time-restricted eating, the periodic fasting, the longevity diet, etc. And then lots of other things, like a lot of medical, of course, interventions are very, very important. And, surgery, for example, they can make a difference between you're going to live to 100 or you're going to die at 12, So, so I think there's all of that is got to be put together into a method. And this shocking thing is that this method is completely ignored by the healthcare system. And this is why in the United States, we spend 10 times more than Colombia on healthcare, and we rank lower than Colombia on healthcare and healthcare quality, right? Yeah, I'm surprised that people are not on the street saying, this is not good. You know, I'm paying a lot of money for this service, and I'm getting a terrible, terrible result, you know? So, you know, imagine anything else, right? If it was anything else, people would be like, hey, I want my money back, you know? But
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
you know, this doesn't happen in healthcare. And so at some point, the Europeans and the Americans and everybody else is going to rebel, right? I think it's going to be soon, you know, but yes.
And you actually mentioned something in your paper that resonates a lot with me, and is you know, our medicine has been focusing on pharmacological treatments, and the 100% approach to pharmacology and giving a patient a pill, a medication, sometimes there are collateral changes that you are not considering, either because you don't know all the metabolic pathways that you are interfering with, or because you are not taking into consideration the compensatory mechanisms of your body. So I think we are at a point in which more holistic approaches, tackling the problem from different perspectives, like nutritional changes, definitely has room. Not even as an adjunct. I think it should be mainstream, to be honest. And that's something that you have been consistently showing in your research. And the next thing you mentioned, longevity, and it's something that people are particularly interested in. Sometimes not only knowing the mechanisms, but knowing why this is happening, and in terms of prescription, what should we do to try to live longer and healthier. So everything comes down to inflammation, I suppose, right? So the why these diets have been associated with more longevity. Where do insulin resistance, inflammation, how do these come together?
Yeah. So first of all, to comment on what you said earlier about the drugs, right? So we work with drugs all the time. For example, even in mice, so we use lots of drugs plus fasting mimicking diet for cancer, right? And I always say we never cure the mouse without the drugs. So, you know, this is not about saying drugs are bad, because in some cases there's central importance, right? But, you know, the big problem, in addition to the side effects that you mentioned, is the fact that you're preventing people from getting there the right way, right? So let's say you have blood pressure of 142 systolic. Well, you know, you could take drugs, or let's say cholesterol at 210. You can take drugs, and that fixes the problem. But you could also have changed your diet, and that may have fixed a lot of problems that are going to come in the future, right? So because now you have the drug to lower cholesterol, lower blood pressure, you may say, I'm done, I'm good to go. And this is exactly what happens, you know, in Europe, the United States. And then the doctor should be like, no, you're not done, you know, I could even give you that drug. But the idea is to take it away from you, and you go back to the right weight, you go back to the right blood pressure, and to the right cholesterol, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big issue there, and that we are ignoring. But yeah, insulin and inflammation. This really, if you think about, I always start my talks with a slide, right? And I show obesity and smoking as the top risk factors for cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer, cancer. And then the next slide, I show how they compare as risk factor compared to 30 years of aging, right? And they disappear, right? So 30 years of aging are so much more powerful as risk factors on Alzheimer, cancer, and cardiovascular disease than obesity and smoking, even put together, that they almost disappear, right? Yeah. So then why am I saying this? I'm saying this because it's all about aging, right? If you can reduce, like for example, Alzheimer, if you can make somebody 10 years younger, you're gonna cut Alzheimer by 50% or more, right? If you just did that. So that's how key aging is. And so aging is at the center of everything. Why? Because most 20-year-olds don't have inflammation. Most 20-year-olds don't have high cholesterol. They don't have high insulin. They don't have a high A1C. So why? Why are they so perfect? Well, they're young. So it's really about, so the inflammation, we work a lot on inflammation. And sometimes for example, when we were working on this paper on inflammatory bowel disease, we realized that inflammation was part of a repair process, right? So inflammation was actually, and I think it was called regenerative inflammation. And a lot of the same markers that are viewed as enemies, they're actually contributing to the tissue rebuilding, but they couldn't do it because so I'm saying inflammation in our head is a bad word, but most likely inflammation, it was always there to repair problems and not to cause problems. And so even the inflammation, if turned the right way, and this is where fasting and fasting mimicking diets and other interventions come in, because they seem to make inflammation, they target inflammation against the problem in a way that a problem is solved instead of problem is created. So then you probably have an inflammatory moment and a non-inflammatory moment following the inflammatory moment. And the combination of them is probably very important to repair tissues.
Yeah, and from the practical standpoint, because we are moving in that direction now, before we discuss a little bit about molecular mechanisms, there are two questions that I have. The first one, is there any effect on sleep when you start fasting? That's the first question. And the second one is that one of the problems that I have seen with the diets and fasting is adherence to the regimen. So the first part of the question is any effect on sleep. The second one, what can we do to improve the compliance?
Yeah, so the effect on sleep, we heard that from many patients doing the fasting mimicking diet, but we are now formally testing it now in a large trial in southern Italy, where we're asking patients to wear a ring. And so that ring allows us to monitor their sleep, and so we'll know officially how it benefits them. But we suspect it's going to have benefits. And then your second part of the question was
adherence.
Adherence, yeah. So. Yeah, adherence has been pretty high. I mean, for example, we finished the trial on, mostly obese diabetic patients in collaboration with Anno Pale at the University of Leiden in Holland. And we were surprised how adherent, even once a month, the obese diabetes patients were to the diet. So I forget the compliance, but it's around 80%. Even monthly cycles in a population that clearly started with lots of eating problems. So I think that the adherence could get probably in the 90s if the right team was available, right? So if the doctor is aligned with the dietitian, when necessary with a psychologist and with the patient, right? So with this team acting together, I think that compliance could get into the 90s, but without it, it could go down all the way to the 50s. So if people were just handed over a fasting mimicking diet and say, you're on your own, you should do this 3 times a year, but nobody's going to help you do it.
Yeah. Thank you. And now going back to the circadian cycle, I was actually very intrigued by what you mentioned about the balance in terms of 2 different axes that kind of oppose each other depending on if you are on the fed state or on the fasting state. You mentioned on the one hand you have insulin, AKT, and all the anabolic pathways. And on the other hand, you have the kinase associated with AMP that does the opposite. So can you elaborate a little bit more about those mechanisms and how important it is for them to coexist?
Well, I mean, I think that we often simplify things and say, am I eating, am I not eating, right? But you also have to look at, the food takes a couple of days and sometimes longer to be digested, right? I mean, fully, let's say, going through the intestine fully. And so, so then, if you eat it at 8 p.m., there are things that, absorptions that happen, let's say, by midnight, but there are others that happen later. And so there is a whole very complex, requirement in different organs, right? Some organs may have increased AKT or AMP kinase, and some organs at the same time may have decreased. So the liver could be going in the opposite direction compared to your muscle, right? Because the liver may be, trying to do gluconeogenesis to feed the brain, right? And it also may depend on how much glycogen you have in reserve, right? And it could be 3 o'clock in the morning. And right, so I think it gets very complicated, and I think that unfortunately we often simplify all of this, so and maybe because historically nutrition was viewed as like some boring, irrelevant, part of medicine or biology, but it's changing, and I think people are going to have to respect the complexity of it. So then things can, at the same time, can go in the exactly opposite direction. So the liver is now trying to make glucose, in the middle of a starvation period. And it makes sense, right? So that's what it wants. If the blood glucose is getting to low enough levels.
Yeah, and continuing along the same line of metabolic pathways, recently there have been a lot of interest in the conversion or transition of white fat into brown fat with different strategies, exercise, especially strenuous exercise, also sauna, cold plunges, all this. So intermittent fasting and the different types of fasting that you mentioned, do they have any effect on browning of the fat?
Yes, right. And so we're now formalizing this in different studies. And so we'll see, but I think that the bigger point is to contextualize it into, well, what does it mean? Because people a lot of people, and also a lot of doctors, they like to attach health and benefits to one marker, brown fat, ketone bodies, low glucose, whatever. So this is a big mistake, right? Because I think that, you have to look at the program, and you have to look at the lifelong program. So, for example, we know from epidemiological studies that some extra, probably white fat, in somebody that is older, is associated with reduced mortality, right? So now all of a sudden, that the same problem or risk factor becomes potentially a protective factor, and so so that's why I don't like to assign, say, ketone bodies. Is that a good thing? Do you want a ton of ketone bodies? Absolutely not, right? It's not a good thing. It can be a good thing, and it's, and some people may have low levels of ketone bodies all the time, and so maybe having some extra ketone bodies could be very good for you. But it could also be that having lots of ketone bodies all the time is very bad for you. And same thing with brown fat, so is that good or bad? I mean, I don't know, right? You need to look at, well, what's the consequence of having a lot of brown fat all the time, right? Maybe it's good in a certain condition, maybe it's really bad in another condition, or maybe it's really bad for person B, whereas it's great for A, or maybe it's very bad for a pregnant woman when it could be incredibly good for, somebody that is a male that is gaining weight, right? So this personalization, this sophistication, now, unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's going to have to be, part of the discussion, and people, and because it's very scary what's happening. People go home and improvise, and if they decide the ketone bodies or brown fat is good for them, then they'll try anything that makes that brown fat go higher, right? And but now, most likely, you're going to have a problem rather than a solution just generated in that person. Even though, you're going to have a ton of brown fat, but now what else do they have? And now, do we just cause maybe even a disease in that person? Because for 10 years, it's been working on every supplement that causes brown fat to go up.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. The complexities are such that you cannot simplify just by giving a single prescription that fits everybody. And that's actually my next question before we close. Understanding all these complexities and knowing all the metabolic effects associated with fasting in its different modalities, what do you think is the main goal for someone who wants to have better health, try to avoid inflammation and maintain insulin sensitivity like within normal levels? What would be the recommendation? Not in terms of what to do exactly, but what should be the main goal to be pursued?
Well, the main goal would be to intervene with very well established nutritional interventions and exercise, and again, has to be some of the ones that we discussed, of course, but not only that they are beneficial, but they're very clearly associated or not associated with problems, right? And it should not be just what happens in the next 6 months. It should be what happens all the way to the 105 years of age. So I always tell people, Carlo Bava, who I followed Emma Morano until when she was 112 to when she was 117, and the oldest person in the world in northern Italy. And Carlo Bava, when she turned 100, gave her 100 to 150 grams a day of raw red meat. And so Emma used to say, well, I talked to journalists, and this journalist just came by and said, Mrs. Morano, aren't you worried that you're going to get cancer? So, yeah, of course, the red meat is associated with cancer, but for a 100-year-old, that was not the problem that Carlo was facing. He knew her problem was anemia. Her problem was infectious diseases, right? So, hey, he might have made the difference between her dying at 102 and her making it to 117 and being the oldest person in the world. Yeah. So this is just an example of the sophistication that's got to go in there, and the type of interventions that you need to get there. But certainly, the fasting mimicking diet, what I call the longevity diet, exercise 150 minutes a week, mostly plant-based, protein that are low but sufficient, time-restricted eating, So those are some of the things that are at the very center of the longevity recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice, and I think that way we can come to a close. And it has been really a pleasure talking with you. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And basically, what you are doing is not only the publication of the papers, but it's like a new approach that is definitely resonating with a lot of people. And I am completely sure that the results of your research is having more and more impact. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And for our audience, in the description of the video, you will find the link to the paper that we discussed today. And don't forget to leave us the feedback in the comment section. Thank you for being with us today, and see you in the next episode.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or thoughts about today's topic, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave your comments down below. For more information and references related to today's discussion, you can find them in the video description below. We appreciate your support and look forward to having you back for our next episode.